The air over Range 17 was not merely hot, it was a physical weight, a shimmering, tangible presence that pressed down on the dusty California hills and warped the very light of the sun. It smelled of scorched earth, cordite, and the bitter tang of overheated metal. This was the kingdom of Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Hartman, and he ruled it not with a scepter, but with a voice that was less a tool of communication and more a geological event. It was a rockslide of a voice, all gravel and command, capable of stripping the confidence from a man at 50 paces. He stood now, a monument of muscle and sun-leathered skin, his barrel chest straining the fabric of his meticulously kept fatigues, observing the line of Marine recruits as they fumbled with their rifles. They were boys, all of them, soft clay he was tasked with firing into the hardness of men. Hartman's worldview was a simple brutalist architecture. The world was a pyramid of strength, and he had clawed his way to a comfortable ledge from which he could look down. Strength was loud. It was visible. It was the crack of a perfectly zeroed rifle, the thunder of a drill command, the satisfying tremor of fear in a subordinate's eyes. Weakness was quiet. It was hesitant. It was the averted gaze and the stammered reply. He saw these recruits, their nervous sweat plastering their shirts to their backs, and he saw weakness that needed to be hammered out. His sycophant, Corporal Briggs, a wiry man with a perpetual sneer, stood a half-step behind him, a loyal echo chamber for his gunnery sergeant's pronouncements. Briggs laughed when Hartman laughed, scowled when he scowled, a perfect mirror of manufactured authority. Hartman scanned the firing line, his gaze a physical tool of intimidation. He relished this part, the breaking and remaking. "You maggots think you can shoot?" His voice boomed, scattering a flock of dust-colored sparrows from a nearby oak. "You couldn't hit the ground if you fell out of a plane. You are a collection of disappointments my mother warned me about." Laughter, sharp and nervous, rippled down the line from the recruits. It was the laughter of the terrified, desperate to be on the right side of the joke. Hartman's ego, a carefully constructed edifice of bravado and control, swelled with the sound. He was the sun in this small, miserable solar system, and everyone orbited his heat. This was order. This was how the world worked. His internal monologue was a constant affirmation of this philosophy. He saw men not as individuals, but as instruments. Some were hammers, some were anvils, and some were simply scrap metal to be discarded. He was a master blacksmith, forging weapons. A quiet man was a dull blade, useless in a fight. A hesitant man was a misfire waiting to happen. He had no time for nuance, no patience for introspection. The battlefield, as he understood it, was a contest of wills, and the loudest will always won. It was a simple, satisfying equation that had served him well, elevating him through the ranks by the sheer force of his personality. He had never once considered that the equation might be wrong, or worse, incomplete. His confidence was absolute, a fortress with walls 10 feet thick, but built upon a foundation of sand. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that what you saw was what you got. And he saw everything. It was then, as his sweeping gaze passed over the firing line and towards the shaded benches near the armory shed, that his internal rhythm stuttered. He saw an anomaly, an error in the code of his world. A woman sat there, alone, on a splintered wooden bench. She was not a recruit. Her clothes were wrong. She wore a faded olive-drab hoodie, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, and worn cargo pants. There was no rank, no insignia, nothing to denote her place in the rigid hierarchy that defined his existence. She was small-framed, unassuming, and seemed utterly absorbed in a simple, meticulous task, cleaning the lens of a high-powered rifle scope with a small, square piece of microfiber cloth. She was an island of profound stillness in the sea of his loud, restless energy. The recruits fidgeted, shuffled their feet, their nervous energy a palpable static in the air. Hartman himself was a creature of constant motion, pacing, gesturing, his physical presence a tool of dominance. But she was still. Her focus was so complete, so absolute, that she seemed to create a small pocket of silence around herself, a vacuum that his booming voice could not penetrate. Her movements were economical, her hands moving with a surgeon's precision as she polished the glass in small concentric circles. She was the eye of a storm he did not yet realize he was creating. Hartman stopped pacing. The disruption of his pattern caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The recruits, conditioned to his rhythms, sensed it. Corporal Briggs, the ever-attentive echo, followed his gunny's gaze. "What is it, Gunny?" Briggs asked, his voice a low sneer. Hartman didn't answer immediately. He squinted, his mind processing the image before him through its crude binary filter. She was quiet. Therefore, she was weak. She was focused on a small technical task. Therefore, she was a non-combatant, a techie, a librarian who had wandered onto his sacred ground. She was ignoring him, the center of this universe. Therefore, she was disrespectful. A target presented itself. A lesson needed to be taught, not just to her, but to the recruits. A public demonstration of the natural order. Well, well, Hartman's voice was lower now, but it carried a new and unpleasant current of predatory amusement. Look what we have here, boys. He started walking towards the bench, his boots crunching on the gravel with deliberate theatrical weight. It was a performance, and the curtain was rising. The recruits on the line turned, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They knew the gunny's moods. This was the slow, deliberate prelude to a storm. Corporal Briggs fell into step behind him, a hyena trailing a lion. The woman on the bench did not look up. She continued her methodical cleaning, her posture unchanged, her focus unbroken. To Hartman, this was the ultimate insolence. She was not acknowledging his gravity, his power. He felt an irrational spike of anger, the fury of a king ignored by a commoner. He would make her see. He would make them all see. He stopped directly in front of her, casting a large shadow that engulfed her small frame. The sun beat down on his neck, but he felt a different kind of heat building inside him, the hot flush of righteous indignation. He placed his hands on his hips, a classic pose of unimpeachable authority. The entire range had fallen silent now, save for the distant hum of a generator and the buzzing of insects in the dry grass. All eyes were on the tableau, the mountain of a man and the still, small woman he loomed over. "Lost, little bird," he began, his voice dripping with condescending sweetness. He gestured vaguely towards the administration buildings. "The offices are that way. Wouldn't want you to get a blister out here in the sun." She finished her circle on the lens, held it up to the light to inspect her work, and only then did she lift her eyes to him. They were clear, calm, and utterly devoid of the fear or deference he expected. They were the color of slate, and they simply registered his presence as a fact, like a piece of furniture. "I'm not lost," she said. Her voice was quiet, flat, a monotone that carried no emotional inflection. It was the opposite of his own voice. It was not a weapon, but a simple statement of data. The lack of reaction was like throwing a punch into water. It infuriated him. Corporal Briggs snickered on cue. "She says she's not lost, Gunny." The recruits shuffled their feet, a few of them exchanging uneasy glances. This was more uncomfortable than the usual shouting. Hartman's smile became a tight, predatory grin. "Not lost? Just playing with the big boy toys, then?" He gestured to the rifle components laid out neatly on a cloth beside her. "You know, these things are dangerous. You have to know what you're doing." He was lecturing her, infantilizing her, reducing her to a child who had wandered into her father's workshop. He was building his case for the jury of recruits, establishing her as an outsider, an incompetent fool. She placed the freshly cleaned lens back into its housing with a soft click. "The system was throwing an error," she stated, again in that unnervingly flat tone. "A calibration drift on the vertical axis. I'm correcting it." The technical jargon only fueled Hartman's contempt. He saw it as a smokescreen, an attempt by a weak techie to use big words to shield herself. Real strength didn't need jargon. It needed action. "A calibration drift," he mocked, drawing the words out. "Is that what the kids are calling it these days? Back in my day, we called it not knowing how to shoot straight." A ripple of forced laughter went through the recruits. The pressure was building. He was turning the screws, expecting her to break, to apologize, to shrink away. She did none of those things. She simply began to reassemble the rifle with the same calm, economical movements. This was the critical moment. Her refusal to submit, her absolute placidness in the face of his escalating aggression, was a direct challenge to his entire being. It was not a spoken challenge, but a silent, profound one. It suggested that his power, the voice, the posture, the public ridicule, had no effect on her. It suggested he was irrelevant. This was an existential threat to the carefully constructed edifice of his ego. It began to crack. He needed to escalate. He needed to force a reaction, to prove his dominance in a way that could not be ignored. His anger curdled into a specific, ugly purpose. He would not just shame her, he would utterly humiliate her. He took a step closer, invading her personal space, and leaned down, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, menacing whisper that was somehow louder than his shouts. "You know what I think? I think you're a REMF, a pencil pusher from behind a desk who read a manual and thinks she knows this world." He straightened up, turning to address his audience. "What do you say, boys? Think the librarian here can even handle a rifle, let alone calibrate it?" He was setting the stage for the final act. He would create a challenge, an impossible one, and watch her fail spectacularly. Her failure would validate his strength, his worldview, and restore the order she had so quietly disrupted. He reached out and placed a heavy, proprietary hand on her shoulder. It was meant to be a gesture of physical dominance, a final reminder of his size and power. She didn't flinch. She didn't even seem to register the weight of his hand. She finished tightening a final screw on the rifle scope and then, without looking at him, said, "Take your hand off me." The words were quiet, but they cut through the air with the chilling finality of a judge's gavel. For the first time, a flicker of doubt entered Hartman's mind. It was quickly extinguished by a fresh surge of rage. How dare she? He squeezed her shoulder. Or what? He snarled. She finally turned her head and looked at his hand, then back to his face. There was no anger in her eyes. There was nothing. It was like looking at the gray, impassive face of a cliff. "This is your only warning," she said, her voice still a flat line. The absolute certainty in her tone was more unsettling than any threat. He let go, not out of fear, but out of a sudden disorienting confusion. He covered the moment by laughing, a harsh, barking sound. "Oh, feisty. I like it. All right, librarian, you want to play in the big leagues? Let's play." He turned and stalked towards the far end of the range, his mind already designing the impossible test that would be her downfall. Hartman's challenge was a piece of theatrical cruelty. He had Corporal Briggs set up a target at 600 yards, far beyond the standard qualification distance for the recruits' rifles. But that was only the beginning. The target itself was a small steel dinner bell, the kind you might find on a farmhouse porch, suspended by a wire from a wooden frame. The objective was not merely to hit the bell. The objective, he announced with a grand sweeping gesture, was to hit the clapper inside the bell, a sliver of metal barely an inch wide, without hitting the bell itself. "A true marksman," he declared to the watching recruits, "controls every millimeter. This shot separates the operators from the amateurs. It's about breathing, trigger control, and reading a wind that you can't even see." He knew it was an impossible shot. The wind, subtle but treacherous, was drifting across the range, and the heat haze made the target dance and shimmer. It was a setup for failure, a public execution of her perceived arrogance. The woman stood up from the bench. She moved with a liquid grace that belied her unassuming appearance. There was no hesitation, no fear. She walked to the firing line and picked up the rifle she had just been working on. Her preparation was a ritual of silent fluid efficiency. She checked the chamber. She settled the stock against her shoulder, the weapon becoming an extension of her body. She lay prone on the dusty mat, her body a low, stable platform. Hartman watched, a smug smile plastered on his face. He interpreted her deliberate pace as fear, her methodical actions as the fumbling of an amateur trying to remember the steps from a manual. "Having trouble there, sweetheart?" he called out, eliciting another round of snickers from Briggs and a few of the more sycophantic recruits. She ignored him, her world having shrunk to the rifle, the scope, and the shimmering mirage of the target 600 yards away. She brought her eye to the scope she had so carefully calibrated. Her fingers made a series of tiny, almost imperceptible adjustments to the windage and elevation knobs. Click, click, click. They were the sounds of a master locksmith picking an unpickable lock. She was not guessing. She was calculating. Her mind was a ballistic computer, processing the wind she felt on her cheek, the angle of the sun, the subtle dance of the heat waves. She took a breath, let half of it out, and her body became utterly still. The world seemed to hold its breath with her. The recruits leaned forward, their mockery forgotten, replaced by a tense electric anticipation. Even Hartman felt a strange tightening in his chest. Crack. The shot was not the deafening blast of the recruits' rifles. It was a single, sharp, clean report that cut the air like a scalpel. For a full second, there was only the sound of the bullet's passage, a faint whisper tearing through the heat. And then, from impossibly far away, came another sound. Ping. It was not the loud clang of a bullet striking the bell's outer shell. It was a clear, high, perfect note, the note of the clapper being struck dead center. The bell itself swayed slightly, untouched, but its tiny heart had been pierced. A profound, echoing silence fell over Range 17. It was a silence born of shock, of a fundamental law of physics being casually defied. The recruits stood with their mouths half open, their eyes wide with disbelief. Corporal Briggs's sneer had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed stare. The world had tilted on its axis. The mask of arrogant certainty on Gunnery Sergeant Hartman's face shattered. It did not just crack, it disintegrated, revealing the pale, naked shock beneath. His mind, which operated on such simple, brutal logic, could not process what it had just witnessed. It was impossible. The wind, the heat, the distance, the size of the target. It was a 1-in-a-million shot, a fluke, a miracle. But he had seen her preparation, the cold, clinical precision. He knew, in a place deeper than his pride, that it was not luck. It was mastery, a level of mastery so far beyond his own comprehension that it felt like a form of magic. His entire worldview, the pyramid of strength he had built his life upon, crumbled to dust in the space of that single, perfect, impossible ping. The woman showed no sign of triumph. There was no smile, no glance towards the crowd to gauge their reaction. Her face remained a placid mask of professional focus. She cycled the bolt on the rifle, ejected the spent casing, and laid the weapon carefully back on the rack. She then walked back to her bench, sat down, and picked up her microfiber cloth, preparing to clean another piece of equipment as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if she had not just rewritten the laws of marksmanship in front of 24 witnesses. Her indifference was the final devastating blow. It communicated, more profoundly than any boast, that for her, this impossible feat was simply business as usual. It was nothing, and by extension, his challenge, his authority, he himself, was nothing. Just as the stunned silence began to fray at the edges, a new sound intruded. It was the crunch of tires on the gravel access road, growing steadily closer. A black command vehicle, the kind reserved for high-ranking officers, rolled to a stop a few yards away. The dust had not yet settled when the passenger door opened and a man emerged. He was tall and lean, wearing the crisp, starched fatigues of a full-bird colonel. His movements were calm and economical, and his presence radiated an aura of quiet, unshakable authority that made Hartman's loud dominance seem like the blustering of a child. This was Colonel Vance, the base commander. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in the entire scene in a single sweeping glance: the stunned recruits, the pale-faced gunnery sergeant, and the quiet woman on the bench. Colonel Vance's gaze settled on Hartman, and the temperature on the range seemed to drop by 20 degrees. "Gunnery sergeant," the colonel's voice was low, calm, and utterly cold. It held none of Hartman's performative volume, yet it commanded more authority in its quiet intensity than Hartman's loudest roar. "Report! What precisely do you think you're doing with my range and these recruits?" Hartman's training kicked in. He snapped to a semblance of attention, his face a mess of confusion and dawning fear. "Sir, we were conducting a marksmanship demonstration, sir." The lie was weak, pathetic, and he knew it. It dissolved in the colonel's icy stare. Vance did not even grace the lie with a response. His attention shifted to the woman on the bench, and the entire quality of his expression changed. The cold authority softened, replaced by something that looked like profound respect, and perhaps a hint of weary surprise. He walked past Hartman as if he were a piece of furniture and stopped before her. She looked up from her work, her expression unchanging. "I didn't realize you were stateside," Vance said, his voice now holding a low, reverential tone that was utterly alien to the recruits who had only ever heard him speak with the voice of command. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Just for a few days. Running diagnostics." The colonel nodded, then turned his gaze back towards the frozen assembly of Hartman and the recruits. His eyes hardened again. "Gunnery Sergeant Hartman," he said, his voice like chipping ice. "You stand on a range used to train United States Marines, and you chose to use it for a cheap bullying spectacle. You took aim at someone you knew nothing about, assuming their silence was weakness and their gender was a punchline." He took a step closer to the trembling gunny. "Your failure today is not one of marksmanship. It is a catastrophic failure of leadership, of judgment, and of basic human decency. You mistake noise for strength and swagger for competence. You are a liability." He paused, letting the words hang in the hot, still air. Then he looked at the woman again, and back to the utterly bewildered faces of the recruits. "Let me educate you all," he said, his voice now taking on the quality of a history lesson, a recitation of scripture. "You think you know what a warrior looks like. You think it's about the size of your muscles or the volume of your voice." He gestured with his chin towards the woman. "You are looking at Chief Warrant Officer 5 Elena Petrova. To most of the world, she doesn't exist. She has no official command. She wears no rank on her collar, because rank is irrelevant to what she is." He let that sink in. A Chief Warrant Officer. 5. The most senior and respected technical expert in the armed forces. A unicorn. A ghost. "For the last 20 years, Colonel Vance continued, his voice low and intense, while men like your gunnery sergeant were shouting at boys on parade grounds, she was in places you only see in classified briefings. She can field strip and rebuild any piece of hardware in the American arsenal, from a rifle to a Predator drone, in the dark, under fire. The calibration drift, she mentioned, was on the guidance laser of a new drone system. A system so secret your gunnery sergeant doesn't have the clearance to even know its name. The shot you just witnessed was not a trick. It was a diagnostic test. She was confirming her work." He looked directly at Hartman, his eyes filled with a cold fire. "And you used her as a prop for your pathetic ego." The recruits were no longer breathing. They were statues. Their entire understanding of the world was being dismantled and rebuilt, sentence by sentence. The colonel wasn't finished. "She has a call sign," he said, his voice dropping even further, becoming almost a whisper, a sound of pure reverence. "In the quiet, dark corners of the world where real monsters live, they don't tell stories about gunnery sergeants. They tell stories about her. They call her Widowmaker." The name fell into the silence like a stone into a deep well. Widowmaker. It was a myth, a campfire story told by operators in hushed tones, a ghost who moved through the world's most dangerous places, a legend credited with impossible feats of arms and intelligence. It was not a name, it was a title. It was a symbol of a level of competence so absolute it bordered on the supernatural. And she was sitting on a bench, cleaning a lens. The recruits looked from the colonel to the woman, their faces a collage of shock, terror, and a dawning, overwhelming awe. They were in the presence of a living god of war, and they had watched their loud, arrogant instructor treat her like a lost child. Colonel Vance took a deep breath, his back ramrod straight. He turned to face Petrova fully. Then, in the blistering heat of the California sun, in front of 24 raw recruits and a broken gunnery sergeant, the full-bird colonel, the base commander, snapped his heels together. His arm shot up in the sharpest, most precise, most deeply respectful salute any of them had ever witnessed. He held it, his eyes locked on hers. It was not a gesture between ranks. It was a gesture from one professional to a master, an acknowledgement of a power so far beyond his own that the only possible response was formal, absolute respect. Petrova looked at him, gave another one of her small, economical nods, and then, after a moment, returned the salute with a clean, simple motion. The transfer of power was complete. The kingdom of the loud had fallen, and the quiet had inherited the earth. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Colonel Vance dismissed Petrova with another respectful nod, which she returned before gathering her gear and departing as quietly as she had arrived. Then, the colonel's full, undivided, and ice-cold attention returned to Gunnery Sergeant Hartman. There was no shouting. The rebuke was delivered in a low surgical voice that cut Hartman to the bone. He was relieved of his duties as an instructor, effective immediately. An official inquiry would be launched. His career, the very core of his identity, was over. He stood there, stripped of his authority, his bluster, his very reason for being, a hollowed-out man in the harsh sunlight. He offered a choked, inadequate apology that the colonel simply ignored. He was no longer a hammer, he was scrap metal, and he was being discarded. The recruits, the chorus, were forever changed. They had witnessed the complete and total demolition of one kind of power by another. Their definition of strength had been irrevocably rewritten. It was not the swaggering bravado of the gunny, it was the quiet, profound, and terrifying competence of the woman they now knew as Widowmaker. They looked at the empty bench where she had sat, and it now seemed like a sacred space. They glanced at each other, a shared understanding passing between them. They had learned the most important lesson of their young careers. The most dangerous person in the room is never the loudest one. Their mockery had curdled into a deep and abiding reverence that would shape them into a different, better kind of soldier. As Petrova walked away from the range, her footsteps silent on the gravel, she noticed one of the recruits fumbling with the sight on his own rifle. Without breaking stride, she paused beside him for a single moment. She didn't look at his face, only at the weapon. "Your windage is off by 2 clicks to the left," she said in her flat technical monotone. "This crosswind is deceptive. It eddies near the tree line." The recruit froze, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude. He could only manage a stammered, "Yes, ma'am." She gave a final nod and continued on her way, her mind already moving past the drama of the range, past the broken gunny and the awestruck recruits, and on to the next problem, the next system, the next quiet, critical task that the world depended on her to solve. She was utterly indifferent to the legend she had just reinforced. The story of that day on Range 17 spread through the base like wildfire. It became a piece of institutional folklore, a cautionary tale whispered from seasoned NCOs to new recruits. It was called The Day the Gunny Met the Ghost, and its details were embellished with every telling. The target became smaller, the distance greater, the wind a raging hurricane. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained. It was a lesson, burned into the collective memory of the base. Do not judge, do not assume. And for God's sake, show respect to the quiet ones, for you never know when you are in the presence of living history. The legend served as a potent vaccine against the disease of arrogance. Years passed. Marcus Hartman was no longer a gunnery sergeant. After a formal reprimand and a forced early retirement, he found himself in the civilian world, adrift. The edifice of his identity, built on the weak foundation of military authority, had not survived the transition. For a long time, he was a bitter, angry man. But the memory of that day, The perfect, impossible ping of the bell and the cold, quiet authority of the colonel's rebuke worked on him like water on stone. Slowly, painfully, he began to understand. He eventually found work as a firearms instructor for a private security firm. He was a different kind of teacher now. He was quiet, patient, methodical. The rock slide of his voice had been worn down to a calm, steady current. His favorite lesson, the one he began every new class with, was always the same. "Listen up," he would say, his voice low and serious. "The first and most important rule of survival is this: the loudest one in the room is always the weakest. The one you need to watch is the one you don't notice." He was teaching the very lesson he had been so brutally forced to learn. In his own broken way, he had found a kind of redemption. And Elena Petrova, the widowmaker, was a world away. She was perhaps in a sterile server room deep underground, her fingers flying across a keyboard as she hunted for a ghost in the machine. Or maybe she was in a quiet library in a foreign capital, poring over ancient maps to find a new way through an old problem. She never thought about that day on the range. It was a minor data point in a life filled with extraordinary events, a brief and unpleasant interaction that was quickly archived and forgotten. She was still quiet, still focused, still moving through the world like a ghost, utterly unaware and unconcerned with the ripples she left in her wake. She was the master who had no need for disciples, the legend who did not care for her own story. Her work was her legacy, and it was written in silence. There exists in the world a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of strength. We are conditioned to see it as a performance, a broadcast, the roar of an engine, the boom of a voice, the flexing of a muscle. Arrogance is the understudy of confidence, a loud and clumsy mimic that mistakes volume for substance. It constructs a shell around a fragile core, a brittle edifice of bravado that must be constantly reinforced by the fear and deference of others. This kind of strength is a hollow thing. It is a suit of armor with no one inside, all surface and no depth. It is loud because it is desperate to be heard, desperate to convince itself of its own reality. It must constantly conquer and dominate the space around it, for in silence and stillness, it ceases to exist. True strength, true competence, operates on an entirely different principle. It is not a performance, it is a state of being. It is quiet, for it has nothing to prove. It is still, for it is in perfect equilibrium. It does not need to broadcast its power, because its power is inherent, woven into the very fiber of its existence. Like the deep, silent pressures in the ocean's abyss, this strength is invisible, yet it can crush steel. It is the quiet professional, the hidden master, the one who has transcended the need for validation. Their work is their voice, and their results are their testimony.